Hello, and welcome to this webcast entitled How Performance Monitoring Leads to Better, Faster Code Deployment. I'm Joyce Chuchian, contributing editor for IDG Strategic Marketing Services, and I'll be your moderator today. Today, modern businesses have many demands, from external customers and internal employees to technology that can't always keep up. Often, what defines a modern business is how quickly and efficiently a business can release high-quality code to production. So simply hire more DBAs to write more code and monitor any database issues in production? Not exactly. Many businesses run into unforeseen complications with DevOps due to miscommunication, misalignment of responsibility and authority, as well as feedback loops that have gone awry. This results in development projects that are delivered late and not often up to par. This webcast will focus on how performance monitoring can help developers gain immediate visibility into how their code is performing. We'll also discuss how it can give your team and organization a data-driven edge, a key factor to remaining competitive and meeting high-level customer and industry demands. Joining me here today to discuss how performance monitoring can foster better, faster code development, and also to present a real case study, are two experts. First, we have Schwartz, CEO and founder of VividCortex. Baron is a widely recognized expert on database internals, web performance, and large-scale application development. He's written several technical books on open-source software used by tens of thousands of engineers every day. Welcome, Baron.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thanks for joining me. Also joining us is Silvia Bostros, MySQL DBA at SendGrid. Silvia's mission is to deploy and maintain various MySQL data stores that support the mail pipeline and other products that SendGrid offers, and to drive MySQL designs from inception to production. Welcome, Silvia.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for joining me as well. I'm looking forward to discussing this topic with both of you today and learning more about how to strengthen DevOps principles and to see what a monitoring-focused work environment looks like. So just a quick note to our audience before we dive into the presentation. This is an on-demand webcast, and you can review the webcast slides and get additional information on today's topic at any time by clicking on the resources icon on your screen. So I'd like to start off with you, Baron. Can you set the landscape for us and tell us what's going on today with DBAs and development and production? What's it been like until now, and what's driving the change?
Sure, happy to talk about that. So as opposed to how we used to build data-intensive applications and how I built them when I was first a developer, my first couple of jobs out of college, we're building things really, really differently today. So in the old days, we used to have this three-tier application architecture where we would have a web server and maybe some server running internal business logic, and then there would be a data tier. And we drew it this way as though it was a single application stack with several tiers, but really we treated the data tier very, very differently. It was not regarded as part of the application stack, and we're not building things that way anymore. Now we really are building systems that have the data tier integrated into the application stack, and in many cases, the data tier is deployed and managed and versioned and shipped and migrated right along with the rest of the application stack. So it's much, much more tightly managed. And to do that effectively, especially at large scale, we're doing things differently. And so some of the things that I'm seeing in the modern apps data tier is that it's a service. We don't think of it as servers anymore. We don't think of a server like the database server running the big Oracle instance or something like that. Instead, we think of data as being provided as a service to the rest of the company, and a service similar to many others inside the company. So, for example, developers will rely on the data as a service being available to them, but they don't have to worry about how it's run. They only have to worry about how their application interacts with it and, in fact, consider it a part of the application instead of something separate as they used to. A second aspect of that is that data is considered to be part of the application deliverable in many cases. So the data itself, not the services and the programs and the database RDBMSs that are running all of this, but sometimes the data itself is considered as part of the application deliverable. So what a developer ships to production today may now include some data as well as code and functionality and configuration and things like that. And finally, we're seeing a pretty dramatic shift in the way that companies are operating these data services internally. Now that they're thinking of them as a service rather than a bunch of services, we're seeing teams that are dedicated to operating them, but not in the same way. So data platforms, as we call them inside of a lot of companies, the role is shifting. It's in Silvia's case, Silvia still has a title that includes DBA, but in a lot of cases, we're seeing titles that are like data engineer or data platform team or infrastructure platform team, data services, things like that. So the shift in mindset is also generating a shift in titles, and it really reflects a difference in the role of what those folks are doing. Whereas in the old days, we used to install a server, rack it. We used to rack it, put an operating system on it, install the software on it, patch it, get it up to the latest version, monitor it, secure it, back it up, all of those kinds of things. Today, a lot of that is built into a service, so there's actually software that's doing those things, whether it's a platform like Amazon's RDS or it's a platform that companies are building internally. It's software that's doing that. It's not humans kind of babysitting servers anymore. And these things are happening because of some really big, I would call them tectonic shifts. I've called them on the slide here. I've called them macro trends. And a couple of those are really pretty near and dear to my heart. One of them is that companies are becoming a lot more data-driven. And I think we've heard a lot about data-driven companies, data being a sustainable competitive advantage. The reasons why are not always really clear to everybody, though. And in a nutshell, I boil it down to this. If you are a data-driven business, then you're able to focus on what your customers want instead of focusing on what you're doing. So not being data-driven, you really have no way to understand your customers from their own perspective. So what happens instead is that companies become very sort of internally centric instead. But companies that can be very data-driven are very customer-centric, and customer-centric businesses are winning. You can look at almost any industry, any category, any vertical, and you can see that a business is winning there that is customer-centric, that is data-centric. And if not, then, it's probably ripe for disruption. So this is becoming the new norm. And what this leads to is that modern applications are data-intensive. And this is a term of art that I've borrowed from a man called Martin Kleppman, who wrote a book on building data-intensive applications. It's a great term. It expresses that the bottleneck in a lot of modern applications is not compute. We used to build a lot of applications that did a lot of computation on a small amount of data, and we were bottlenecked on essentially CPU power. But that's not the case today. A lot of applications today are bottlenecked on the size of the data that they have to store and analyze. So those data-intensive apps are really driving a lot of shift in how we build and operate modern applications. So both of these things together lead to companies adopting a cloud mindset, whether they're actually running on a cloud like Amazon's or Azure or something like that or not. They're operating their internal systems a lot like a cloud. In other words, those systems are not administrators logging into servers and running something at the command line. They are pieces of software, very complex platforms that are operating the foundation of these data-driven businesses. And since those services are being provided in that operational platform-driven kind of a way, the role of the DBA, again, is shifting away from babysitting servers to building and operating those platforms. And as a result, the developers are expected to be more full stack than they used to be. In other words, developers used to be able to ask DBAs to help them model their data correctly and choose the right indexes and examine execution plans and things like that. They trusted that the database administrators were going to be there to do that for them because they were the internals experts who knew the gnarly bits about how the database worked. But these days, the database is, again, provided as a service, as a platform, and so the developers are expected to know how to use those platforms well.
Okay, thank you, Baron. Excellent background. So can you talk about what some of the challenges are? Are data-driven systems a burden? And if so, why is that?
Yeah, they can be. They really can be. Everybody wants this idea of becoming a data-driven business it's pretty popular. I think if you talk to CIOs, even CEOs in many companies, this would be on their mind. All of their peers are talking about it. They're wondering, how can we be more data-driven? How can I create a culture that's data-driven? And the answer often comes in the form of processes and tools and, let's get people excited about getting answers from data instead of anecdotes and, we should be measuring everything we should be measuring. And what they find out soon is that two things happen. One, it's a lot of data and a lot of systems are required to run that. And those systems are pretty tough to run. Operationally, they're not a lot of fun. And if they're not run very well, the second thing becomes really important, which is that everybody is depending on them. Internally, people are depending on them for answers and for making good data-driven decisions. externally, they become part of the services. And this can creep in kind of organically, but suddenly that data, whether it originated internally or externally, if it's down, if it's slow, if it's wrong, if anything is wrong, then somebody somewhere is having a bad experience. And so the sensitivity around this and the difficulty of solving these operational problems gets to a point where companies realize that they're having trouble running their data systems, and it's kind of a millstone around their neck. They didn't anticipate it. They thought, I'll just deploy the latest, hottest, newest big data platform. It's a data lake. It's going to solve all of my problems. And then suddenly they realize, now I've got more problems. And the solution to those problems is often that to run those systems well, you have to be data-driven about how you run them, too. So it's kind of like one of those recursive GIF memes that you'll see on the Internet. I wanted to be data-driven, so I instituted a whole bunch of data initiatives, and now I have to be data-driven about my data initiatives, too. So there's a lot of complexity. Always in building these kinds of complex systems, there's a lot that we don't see that's below the surface, and this is certainly one of them.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to turn our attention to Silvia Bostros from SendGrid, who's had firsthand experience facing the challenges of DBA developers and can give us an idea of what a monitoring-focused work environment actually looks like. So Silvia, can you first tell us a little bit about SendGrid?
Sure. SendGrid is a cloud-based email platform. What we do is handle serving millions of emails for our customers on a day-to-day basis. Customers of ours are pretty well-known brands, companies like eBay, Spotify, Yelp, where instead of them having to build businesses systems to basically handle all that email delivery, we kind of take care of that for them. To show a little bit of the scale of what we have to handle, we send on average 1 billion emails a day. We have about 1.7 billion unique email recipients that we send to on a monthly basis. We have 50,000 paying customers in over 100 countries around the world. So while it may seem a surprise to some people that email delivery might be a large business, it's actually pretty huge, and it's still a very well and alive channel of communication.
Wow, that's quite impressive. 1 billion emails a day and over 100 companies worldwide. I could see how you might have some challenges. So what kind of challenges were you having in terms of DevOps?
So to harken back to something that Baron just said about how the role, even the title itself, has always been DBA, and yes, that is still my title. And when I started at SendGrid, that was a very old school kind of role where I was expected to manually install databases and be the person who is the eyes and the ears of the developers, where if there's something that they wrote that is not behaving very well in production, I would have to be the one to walk over to where they are or email them and be like, hey, this query you're writing is not great, it's not performing. And it was a very slow feedback loop. We are a company that has been growing as far as like the team has been growing exponentially. When I started, it was 65 people, the entire company. Now we are 400 employees. As you can imagine, having a human-based feedback loop for how the databases are performing was just not going to cut it. My responsibilities were expanding. We were deploying new clusters almost every month. When I started, we had maybe 3 database clusters, which was already more than what many companies used to have. Like Ben was just saying, it used to be just one big Oracle pod. Right now, I believe the number of clusters I have is getting close to 30, and that's 30 distinct data sets. So for each one of those, there's a whole set of things to have to watch out for: performance, the architecture design, how well the data is actually being used, how efficient it is when certain pieces of the product are becoming more popular than others. And so there came a point, an inflection point a few years ago, when we realized that I simply cannot be the human gatekeeper of all of this. We needed something that would help the engineers essentially help themselves and be able to know very quickly that something is working out or something is not working out, to be able to see that the code they're writing is truly providing the value that they have promised the business when they were starting to work on it. And so a few years ago, through contact with Baron, he and I spoke about it a little bit, and then I started actually looking into automating essentially, or maybe automating is not the best word, providing my internal customers, who are essentially all the engineering team, with a better way of being able to tell when something is working out in their code or not.
Okay, so the human gatekeeper was no longer effective. So what were some of your key considerations when you were looking for a solution to the DBA challenges?
We needed something that would be very easy to use. it was not plausible at that point to expect our engineers, on top of all of their commits, things they have to write for the product and, maintaining existing stuff and fixing bugs in their own code, to also go and learn how to find things like the slow logs. And, I know Baron wrote this tool as well. It's an old tool that we DBAs have. It's called Query Digest, but it was written for DBAs. It is terminal-based. It also requires access to boxes that, from the security standpoint, we might not want everybody in the company to be able to access. So there were a lot of considerations where it needed to be something that would provide everything in an easy-to-use format, and at the same time not cause, obviously, issues in production. Before VividCortex and before products like that, the only way to truly be able to tell exactly everything the database is doing, it involves turning on verbose logging on the database, which is a huge load issue. And at SendGrid, when we started working with VividCortex, we were pushing on one of our clusters to the order of 13,000, 14,000 transactions a second. So trying to make the database write that into logs all the time was going to be a huge undertaking and very possibly an outage situation. So we needed something that would be able to tell us in a very good package for the engineers, how to see what the performance is like without actually causing problems.
Okay, thank you. So making sure it was easy to use, not causing production issues, and an easy way to monitor everything as well. Okay, so given those considerations, tell us about some of the benefits of VividCortex.
So one of the stories I like to tell, because this is one of the very first things we worked with the VividCortex team on, I guess it was, in retrospect, good coincidence that we were facing this issue while I was testing the VividCortex platform. We had a bug in one of our systems where we were seeing IPs that we basically assigned to customers as dedicated IPs to send their emails on. We were starting to see issues where the IPs were being moved without us knowing exactly how. And we tried multiple things like adding logging to our application to try and catch that on that side. Ultimately, we asked the VividCortex team if their agent would be able to actually help with this. We basically collaborated on this and told them what table it was. They started tracking that, and I started getting reports from the team about access to that specific table. Ultimately, we found out that this was a transactional conflict issue and that we probably would have spent months and potentially had to resort to general logging, which would have been a big undertaking to try to find it, because it was not a bug in the application as much as it was a combined issue of how the database was configured and how the application was making presumptions as to the transactions that are going to run on the database. So it was definitely one of those cases where if we didn't have VividCortex, we would have had to go through some business impacting exercises to try and figure out what was going on.
So would you say that was customizable then? I mean, that was clearly a specific problem, and you worked together with VividCortex on that?
We did, and that was a while ago. I mean, since then, we've had many, many stories become almost common practice now at SendGrid, where if there's an issue that I've had engineering managers who would find things in our daily report from VividCortex or who will happen to open the portal and see something, and it results into, bug tracking and work that happens on the team side to make things more performant. It has definitely saved us considerable amounts of hardware that we would have had to throw at things when performance degraded. There was another instance, I think about a year ago, where we had some queries that were being part of the pipeline processing that were not performing as well. And before we had VividCortex, the only solution I would have had, just to, lack of time on my part, I would have to add read capacity until we figure out what's wrong. But now that we have a much faster feedback loop, it is much simpler to just go and take a look and be like, yes, this query is not right. Is this an expected volume of that query or an expected latency on that query? No, it's not. Let's go look and see how we can make it better. And it's become much easier for the engineering org as a whole to get visibility into these things and not have to wait for me for like a week to go collect logs and aggregate them and come back with an answer.
Okay, excellent. It sounds like you had a lot going on and a good solution for that. So, Baron, Silvia has told us her situation at SendGrid, and she's talked about some specific issues that were solved, which resulted in a lot more productivity and a lot more time saved. So can you tell us, is this a normal thing? What are some of the trends now, and where is this going to for the future?
Yeah, absolutely. And Silvia and I have known each other for quite a while. I think we got to know each other a lot better when we were discussing these issues that ultimately led to SendGrid becoming a customer of VividCortex. And by the way, VividCortex is also a SendGrid customer. None of this was sort of new or surprising to me because prior to founding VividCortex, I was a performance consultant for a handful of years and ran a pretty large consulting team, wrote a lot of software, a lot of tools. So I saw a lot of really interesting situations in high-load production kinds of systems. And the problems could range anywhere. It could be architectural, it could be a system misbehaving, but the solution was always to measure. And that's really what inspired me to leave that job and found VividCortex so that people could really see what their systems are doing in production. And so SendGrid is, I think, a good example of what we see across our customer base here at VividCortex, too. So I've listed a couple on this slide. Flow.io, their CTO, Mike, spoke at KubeCon in New York not too long ago, talking about how they can develop literally in production. There is one environment at Flow.io, it's production. There's no staging, there is no testing, there are no separate developer sandboxes or anything like that. And what they've done is perhaps a little bit radical by most people's standards, but I think it's actually what's becoming the norm and where we're heading, is with great observability, when you can really see how systems are behaving, the best thing that you can do is actually develop your applications in the real environment that they're going to run in production so that you don't have this kind of mental model of how the thing is supposed to work, and then you put it into production to find out if you were right or wrong. So you're in production the whole time. Another example at DraftKings, when DraftKings became a customer of ours, they had, I think, just one database administrator and then added another, so they were up to two. And then both of those DBAs left, went to other companies, and DraftKings decided that they were not going to hire any more DBAs because they had 400 developers who were all very comfortable, very fluent with interacting with the database. They've platformized a lot of their data tier. They're running on RDS, and they're very sophisticated and mature in their automation and tooling around this. And the old school DBA role of, sort of attaching the right storage and running security updates and patches and things like that it's gone. It's just a business function. It's not a human function anymore. And we see similar benefits for productivity there. And we don't have any DBAs at VividCortex either. In the early days, I hired some DBAs, and then ultimately we migrated it away from having people who considered that databases were something that needed care and feeding. And we've seen the benefits too. And I think our customers were there before we were, honestly. But by avoiding specialization and, something being one person's problem and that person may be busy or trying to work on more strategic things, like if I recall, Silvia at the time that we started working together was one of the things that was kind of on her list of stuff to do was to start investigating some new strategic directions for data platform. And she was feeling unable to do that. I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, Silvia, but I think a short time after that, you were able to get out of firefighting and into building the next platform for the business. And, so those are the kinds of things that I've seen across many of our customers. And again, this isn't that the DBA's job has gone away. It's just that we're treating it more maturely, and we're regarding the DBA as somebody who builds platforms that are actually functioning pieces of software rather than, sitting at a terminal and being ready to type the right command when it's needed. The DBA at VividCortex, we now call them SREs, Site Reliability Engineers, the people who are running that platform, who are building the platform to run the platform itself. That's a fairly common job description for people in the industry these days. And it's about enablement rather than gatekeeping. We no longer regard the database as something that just needs to be kept away from those naughty developers that are going to break it. Instead, we recognize that keeping people away from the systems that they are actually writing critical production software against is just a recipe for disaster because it makes them fly blind. So now, I think our customers have shown us the way to a more modern way of operating our own systems, and we certainly see that across our whole customer base.
Okay, thank you. So DBAs are now seen as a business function rather than a human function, or as you said, site reality engineers. Is that correct?
Yeah, site reliability engineers.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Term that came from Google. And for folks who are interested, there's a great book on that. People treat site reliability engineering a little bit differently from here and there, but Google's original site reliability engineering team and many others wrote a book on that. It's a wonderful read.
Okay, site reliability engineers. Sorry about that. All right, so Silvia, Barron talks about the site reliability engineers, and now that you've solved many issues using VividCortex, what does that mean for DBAs from your point of view? Does this eliminate their role?
Not at all. And what Barron mentioned about my concerns at the time when we started working together are actually correct. When I brought VividCortex into the tool set that SendGrid has, into its visibility into systems, yes, part of it was I wanted to enable engineers, but I will be fully transparent. Part of it was selfish reasons, like I wanted to work on the next platform. It's something that we just announced at SendGrid, where we're changing the way we have our actual pipeline to scale to the next level. And part of that was, and it still is, rewriting a lot of things to microservices, which is becoming a very prominent thing in software development as a whole. And if you do microservices with one large database instance, the way old school is, you kind of don't get any of the benefits. So part of it is becoming your databases just sort of break into smaller pieces that are by concern. And to look at the DBA role with that context as someone who is babysitting servers or manually installing them, it's just not tenable. You'd end up having to hire like an army of them, and it's just not a thing that you can scale. And the same way you want to scale systems, you want your people skills to also scale exponentially. And so since we've installed VividCortex, I've been able to do much more efficient things with my time, like automating things, working with all the teams on design, on architecture, making decisions like, does this belong in MySQL, does it belong in something else? And it's also helped me grow as well into a more advanced role where I'm no longer just spending every day doing manual labor, but instead helping to find strategies for our data layer.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Silvia, and thank you, Barron. This has been very informative. It's a very current topic that seems to be growing very quickly. So before we sign off, I'd like to ask you each for your final advice. Advice for those who are considering something like this, haven't entered it yet, and trying to figure out, where to start, or, any kind of lessons learned, or whatever your words of wisdom would be. Silvia, let's start with you. What advice do you have for those considering a performance monitoring solution?
I would say do your homework on it. It's important to know what your current engineering team skill set is. This will vary from one company to the next, but it's important to look at this as if the engineers are the customers now, and to look for a product like VividCortex that makes their job easier. Ultimately, that's really what you want. And don't treat the databases as walled gardens. Ultimately, that's going to be what slows down everything. And it's important to keep in mind that it's part of the application, it's part of the product, and if you start treating it as so, things will start moving much faster.
Okay, excellent advice. Do your homework, look at the engineers as customers, and, make their jobs easier, and don't treat databases as walled gardens. Very good advice. Barron, what's your advice to potential buyers and IT decision makers?
My advice is really the same thing that I've been telling people since I was a consultant. So it's a 15-year-old advice, I think. And I didn't invent this. I learned it from folks like Carey Millsap, the author of Optimizing Oracle Performance. And that's really to look at your systems and ask, why do I have these systems? They have a job to do. And am I measuring that job? And so when we look at the data tier, whether it's an individual database or it's a collection of databases or maybe even disparate data technologies working together, the job is to store data and to give answers about that. And the way that we store and get answers from our data is by running queries or statements or SQLs. Or there's some kind of a request to those systems, whatever it may be called. So if you're not measuring that, then you're not going to be running it very well. And so ultimately, you can't improve what you can't measure. And so you have to be measuring query performance at the data tier. And then the second thing is cultural, because teams are systems. There's a lot of literature in the general art of management and building scalable teams and communication systems within organizations and things like that. And you can probably tell I'm a big fan of books. Ellie Goldrat's book, The Goal, is one of my all-time favorites, and it tells a story about how a factory can be optimized by looking at where the pieces of work actually go within the system, the factory floor. And it's the same with human systems and with technical systems. And when you introduce specialization or you break feedback loops or you make people run blind or introduce variations or dependencies, delays, things like that into a system, whether it's a human team trying to ship software or whether it's a database server trying to execute a query, you cause a lot of performance problems that can be much, much more severe than your intuition would suggest. So always measure, because that's how you're going to find things. I think that's pretty much my life advice in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you. So understand your systems, be able to measure query performance at the data tier, and always measure, and be ready for a cultural change. Thank you very much. Both of you have excellent advice, and it was great to see a real case study here, because we can learn a lot from that as well. As I mentioned earlier, you've given us a lot to think about and some insightful information for those looking to automate performance monitoring. Many thanks to our guests, Baron Schwartz from VividCortex and Silvia Bostros from SendGrid, for sharing their expertise and advice on how to improve and speed up code deployment with performance monitoring. For more information on VividCortex, please click on the resources icon on your screen. Thanks again to all our listeners. For IDG and VividCortex, I'm Joyce Chachian. Thanks for joining us.